Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about solving absolute value equations. And so the first thing we want to do is remind ourselves what an absolute value does. So an absolute value is the distance that a number is away from zero. Because we're talking about distance, it's always going to be positive. It can't ever be a negative number. We don't ever say, I drove 3 miles to school and then I drove negative 3 miles home. We might be going a different direction, but it's the same distance. Distance is always positive. Let's take a look at an example of that. If I have a positive 4 and a negative 4, I want to know what their distance is from 0. So between negative 4 and 0, there is a distance of 4, and between 4 and 0, there is also a distance of 4. That distance is our absolute value. So when we indicate absolute value with our absolute value bars on each side of a number or an expression, we are talking about doing whatever is inside if there are some simplification steps to take, and then the output is always going to be the positive version of that. So the output of negative 4 in absolute value bars is a positive 4, and the output of the absolute value of positive 4 is also 4. They are equal to each other. So let's summarize this and talk about a couple of other properties that we will make use of with our absolute value equations. The first property is that our absolute values can never be less than 0. It's always greater than or equal to 0. We talked about that above. Because it's a distance, it is never negative. Secondly, we talked about the positive and negative versions of numbers being the same when you take an absolute value. Remember that we had absolute value of negative 4 and absolute value of positive 4 both equal to 4, and that is true for any a number and negative a number. Each one is a distance from 0. Another property is that if we have two numbers inside absolute value bars that are being multiplied by each other, that's the same as taking the absolute value of each separately and then doing the multiplication, and that's called our multiplication property. Finally, another property is that when we are dividing two numbers that are inside absolute value bars, that's the same as taking the absolute value of each number and then doing the division as a second step. So those steps are interchangeable. Remember that this b value in the denominator can't be 0 because everything explodes when you try to divide by 0. It's undefined. So again, this is our division property. We have 3 distinct types of solutions for absolute value equations. The first solution is that we would have 2 solutions, and that's usually the most common. So we're going to have a linear function inside absolute value bars, and it will be equal to a constant c. And remember that c is always going to be greater than 0, not negative. If c is negative, then we have a different type of solution or no solution. So what we will do with the 2 solution scenario is that we are going to maintain what was in the absolute value bars, but we're going to take the absolute value bars away by considering 2 different cases. So this is going to split into 2 equations, one where c remains positive and the other where c is negative. So negative c. So by taking into account that what was inside the absolute value can be positive or negative, then we can get rid of the absolute value bars. As I mentioned, we have no solutions if c in our original equation is less than 0. We'll also have one solution when c is equal to 0 because there is no such thing as a positive and negative 0. In order to solve absolute value equations, we are going to use a method called ISS for short. It stands for isolate, separate, and solve. So when we say isolate, we mean get the absolute value on one side of the equation by itself, like we did this one above. You notice that there's nothing out in front or behind the absolute value. It's on the left side by itself. and the constant is on the other side. Then, just like we did above, we're going to separate into a positive solution and a negative solution to take into account both, and then we'll solve those two basic linear equations.